Alice with WDI China. I'm here with Sheila Jeffries. Hi, Sheila. Thank you so much for coming,
Hey, Alice.
for joining us today. A couple of weeks ago, I and other Chinese lesbian feminists drafted a list of questions to which we'd like to hear your comments. And in this interview, I'm going to ask all those questions. But first, for viewers who might not be familiar with who you are, would you want to just briefly introduce yourself?
Yes, it's hard to do it briefly, but yes. So I am presently 73 years old. Back in the 1970s, in the 1980s, I was involved in the women's liberation movement and in the development of lesbian feminism in the UK, in London. And then I went to Australia. I published 2 books in that time, my first 2 books. And then I went to Australia in 1991, and I left Australia and came back here to the UK, where I am now, in 2015. I taught at the University of Melbourne, where I was a professor, and I've done, I think, 12 books so far at the moment. And my last one was Trigger Warning, which was an autobiography, which has got lots of information about me. And the next one is called Penile Imperialism, the Male Sex Right, and the Subordination of Women. So that's probably enough for now.
Yeah, so for our first question, you described the heyday of political lesbianism in the 1970s in your autobiography, Trigger Warning, as well as in many of your speeches, where women could attend women-only conferences, groups, cafes, and women's centers, and lesbians could spend their entire non-work life in lesbian or at least women's company. But half a century later, in the name of trans rights, women are losing the single-sex spaces we've constructed for ourselves, including online. We can't even agree on what a woman is, because anyone who identifies as a woman today might be considered a woman. Back in your day, political lesbian pioneers like you couldn't have predicted this predicament. What do you think is causing this downfall of feminism?
Well, it's actually been a long process. I mean, the trans rights movement, this movement by men for their sexual excitements of cross-dressing, is fairly recent. But the downfall of feminism started before that. Really by the 1990s, in fact, in the 1980s, there was a beginning of a backlash against feminism, because, of course, our analysis as radical feminists and lesbian feminists was a very broad analysis. We analyzed sexuality and said that sexuality had to be sexualizing equality. We were critical of the beauty practices and the whole way of life of heterosexual male domination in the UK at that time. So that was pretty threatening to male domination. So in the 1980s, what happened was, led particularly by gay men and their politics, there was a sadomasochist movement which opposed the whole analysis of sexuality that we had created and was totally about eroticizing the power difference, mainly the power difference between men and women, but which was then played out by some lesbians and also very many, if not the majority, of gay men. Now, that movement was very, very powerful. The gay press and the sort of left, supposedly progressive press really promoted sadomasochism. It was a very, very hostile time, and it was about the downfall of everything we had wanted. We had believed we could change the world. It had been such a wonderful community and politics and ethics that we'd been involved in and creating. So really, there was a huge backlash then. And of course, some lesbians and feminists did join in to attack those of us who made this broad critique, the radical feminists, the lesbian feminists. So that happened in the 1980s. By the 1990s, there was these big divisions, which were called the sex wars within feminism. That is, between those of us who wanted to transform sexuality because we understood that men's sexuality, which was constructed around their dominance, was extremely dangerous to women. It led to sexual violence and pornography and so on. So the sex wars were between those of us who wanted to transform sexuality, and we believed we could, and those who said, no, sadomasochism is simply what it is, and pornography is fine, and you simply have to accept that. So those who defended the sexuality of male domination. So by the 1990s, it was getting quite difficult to be radical feminist. By the late 1990s, there'd been a very considerable backlash against feminism, and our spaces were closing. We were losing our bookstores. We were losing our publishers. We were certainly losing our dances and discos and meeting places. And we were losing our conferences and all the different groups that we'd set up and so on. These things were gradually closing down or being fought by the sadomasochists. The sadomasochists would, for instance, turn up at a march or at a meeting in their black leather with their swastikas in a very threatening way. It was really quite a frightening time when we were starting to lose everything in the 1990s. So in the 1990s, what also happened was that there was in the academy the rise of postmodernism or post-structuralism, this political theory that actually nothing has any meaning and that there is no point working towards anything because there is no future that we should aim towards. Everything is, just, influx, and power doesn't come from anywhere, and you can't talk about class or sex or race or any of those things. So postmodernism and queer theory, which was really a theory created around the politics of gay men, the sexual politics of gay men, came into the academy, came into the universities in the 1990s. And that was really, really important because those ideas, which were very anti-feminist ideas, started to be taught at that time. So what happened in the university was that I went into the university in the late 1980s, to teach feminist studies, called women's studies at that time. But in the 1990s, these were women's studies, feminist studies were completely under threat. They were all transformed into something called gender studies, in which, instead of sex, they talked about gender and how gender could be completely flexible. And the big theorist of gender was, of course, Judith Butler, who is in fact anti-feminist. And so really, we thought when we went into the universities, we were changing the world. Lots of women came and took courses. Middle-aged women would come back to the universities to learn all of these feminist ideas, and wonderful feminist books were being written. We would wait week by week for the next book by Andrea Dworkin, the next book by another famous feminist theorist. But by the 1990s, the backlash in the universities and against feminist publishing was really happening, and that was very difficult for us. So I know that's different from what's happening now, because the entry of postmodernism and queer politics into the universities in the 1990s, they laid the groundwork for what's happening now, which is this concept of gender as something that could drop on anybody out of the skies and turn them into the opposite sex, and so on. Those ideas came out of the universities and were developed, and they led to, of course, the big and very, very powerful men's rights movement. They say they're interested in the rights to gender identity and gender identity expression, which means, of course, they want to flounce around in dresses because it's sexually exciting for them to do that in front of women, in women's spaces, in the Girl Guides Association, and so on and so on and so on. So the movement we're facing now came out of that change in ideas and the backlash against feminism. Those two things allowed this incredibly dangerous and very powerful, very, very abusive men's rights movement to develop, which is now threatening even the word woman. We're not even allowed to talk about ourselves as women. We have to be vagina havers or vulva havers. We can't even talk about our own biology. Women are not allowed to be called mothers now. They're supposed to be chest feeders or possibly parents. So the onslaught upon women is absolutely massive, because being able to understand ourselves as women, the beginning of our movement in the 70s was consciousness raising about ourselves as women. At least we had to have the word woman so that we could understand our oppression, what was distinct about being a woman. All of that is being steamrolled over at the moment by a very, very powerful men's rights movement of cross-dressing, which is, of course, influencing policy. Laws are being created. I don't think I could ever have imagined back in the 70s and 80s, well, we thought everything was going to move forward. It couldn't have occurred to us that men would be as powerful as this and such huge obstacles to us, and dangerous now. very often meetings and marches and things, the men are coming along being actually threatening, being actually physically violent. It's an extraordinary time. Back in the 70s and 80s, nobody bothered us. Men didn't come to any of our marches. We were entirely safe. They didn't care about us. They had no interest. But of course, this men's rights movement has come like, well, it's a part of the involuntary celibates movement, really, which is men online who organize together because they say women won't give them sex or not enough sex or not the right sex or not the right women, and are very, very dangerous and have actually murdered people in the States, men as well as women, in fact, but mostly women because they're so angry. So there's a tremendous anger amongst men at the moment, and in this involuntary celibate movement. And this men's rights movement of cross-dressers is a part of that. So it's a very, very, very difficult time for anybody to be a feminist. And of course, you are part of a new movement trying to establish itself in this very, very, very dangerous and very, very different environment.
Yeah, it's very disheartening to hear that the backlash against feminism comes from like all angles, like from the academia and also from the men's rights movement in the society, like the gay rights movement.
Yes, absolutely. And it is very disheartening. But we are here, Alice. We are still fighting.
Yes. And my next question is, in the 1970s, feminists commonly accepted that choosing to become a lesbian constituted a revolutionary act. Many feminists found it easy to accept that their proclivities were socially constructed and subject to change. According to you, this is not a particularly feminist insight. Social scientists developed the knowledge that, rather than being dictated by biology, human behavior is socially constructed. The idea that sexuality is socially constructed has fallen out of favor in today's conservative era. In terms of sexual orientation, biological determinism reigns supreme. In your opinion, why has that fundamental understanding of social constructionism been overturned?
Well, part of it is a move into very conservative times. When social scientists were promoting the ideas of social construction in the 1950s and the 1960s, it was an optimistic time when it looked as if the world would all be changed towards a equality that now is very, very hard to imagine. So the social constructionists, sociologists actually questioned, they said that sexuality was socially constructed. They weren't feminists, but they pointed out that in many countries around the world, that the expression of sexuality took extremely different forms. And they said that people in a society had a sexual script that was constructed by the pressures, the culture, everything that was going on around them, and that it was learned. They also said that there was no such thing as innate racial inferiority. There was no such thing as the innate inferiority of women. They said none of these things were biological. So it was a very, very hopeful time in which it was possible to imagine considerable social change. Now, from the 1980s onwards, times did change. And with the development of neoliberalism, very right-wing politics in Britain and America, there was an overturning of these common understandings, so towards a much more conservative frame of mind. And that conservative frame of mind says everything's based on biology because it doesn't believe in change. It doesn't want anything to change. They're making their money, they're ruling the world, they're perfectly happy, they don't want anything to change. So presently, there are political scientists who even say that things like voting behavior is biological. They do research to show that people biologically vote conservative and so on. I know it's completely extraordinary, but believe me, as a political scientist, I have to tell you that there is research of this kind. So we're in very, very conservative times, and biology is used to explain everything now, like homosexuality, cross-dressing, pedophilia, and so on and so on. The situation is that the vast majority of gay men always understood themselves as being biological. There were some who believed in social construction, but mostly gay men, in order to try and say, you've got to tolerate us, you should not hate us, you should not have laws against us, they have said that they are biological. I mean, this is silly, of course, because many of them had relationships with women earlier in their lives, many of them come out of marriages to become gay, and so on. So it's very silly stuff, but you can understand why they say it. It is to protect themselves. And in fact, there is research to show that the public will support homosexual law reform, for instance, and gay marriage, if they believe it's biological. But if they believe people are naughty enough to choose or can change their behavior, they will not support it. So in fact, the majority of gay men who always said it's biological were being quite sensible for their objectives. But the fact is that in the 70s and 80s, it was very, very clear to lesbians that their lesbianism, for the vast majority of women, wasn't biological at all, because very many of them had been heterosexual in marriages, some of them 3 marriages. We had lesbians coming out at 75 years old, and because it was just it was about revolutionary freedom, the ability to get out from the oppression of men, from heterosexuality, and become lesbians. And in fact, the fact that lesbians did largely see this as choice was found in some research that a student of mine did. She did her PhD looking at and asking questions of 3 different cohorts of women, cohorts of lesbians, right? So lesbians, she found that lesbians, women who became lesbians in the 1970s, the vast majority thought they chose to be lesbians. They didn't believe in biology. They thought they chose. It was a wonderful time to be a lesbian. They were becoming lesbians with great joy and enthusiasm. It was a wonderful, wonderful thing to do. It was the only political way forward. Then the cohort of women who became lesbians in the 1980s that she interviewed were about half and half. Half thought they were biological and half decided and said that they chose. The group of women that she interviewed from the 1990s, on the other hand, the great majority said it was biological. So the fact is, you can only really think what your times allow you to think. You think according to the ideas in circulation at a particular time. In this very, very conservative time that we're in now, the ideas in circulation do not allow people to think, do not allow women to think they could possibly change their sexuality or choose to change it. Although, of course, it is certainly the case, because I chose in the 70s and 80s, thousands and thousands and thousands of women in the Western world chose to become lesbians, to set up communities and theatre and culture and ethics and philosophy and so on and so on. There was a massive culture and community of women who mostly chose to become lesbians in the Western world. But now, of course, they're all said to be, I mean, there are women who say, there are lesbians who say they can't be real lesbians. They must be somehow bisexuals, or because real lesbians, according to this very, very strict biological time we're in, real lesbians are lesbians as fetuses. They come out of the womb as lesbians. So they manage to escape any kind of sexual violence from men. They manage to escape ever having any kind of interest in men or being pursued by men. They manage to escape all of that and become pure lesbians. And they are the real lesbians, and everybody else is just pretending, really. It's this extraordinary competition to create the top lesbians, who are the pure ones, the gold star lesbians. It's extraordinary because it's very, very counter-revolutionary, because it's saying to heterosexual women, you can't change. You are stuck there. There's something biological that makes you be in men's beds every night. There is nothing you can do about it. And of course, it prevents movement forward, because those lesbians who chose were the force of the movement, the ones who created the rape crisis centers and the domestic violence and refugees and the politics, and wrote the books. The vast majority of radical feminist books from the 70s and 80s were written by women who chose to be lesbians, mostly from the States, it has to be said. So the women who believe in biology, they are standing in the path of the possibility of social change and the possibility of us having a dynamic and powerful feminist movement again.
So I'm curious, like, what happened to those women becoming lesbians in the 1970s? Like, have they stayed as lesbians forever?
Yes, they have.
Oh,
They have.
that's nice to hear.
There may be one or two who didn't, but I don't know
Only
any
one
of
or two. Okay.
all the women I know who became lesbians in the 1970s and 80s are lesbians now, every single one. And they generally say what wonderful, wonderful lives they've had and how they couldn't have had anything like those kinds of freedom and those kinds of joys if they had not become lesbians at that time. But it was very sad for us when the big backlash took place in the late 80s and the 1990s, because we lost so much. And so for a lot of women who chose to be lesbians and other lesbians, or all lesbians, life became much lonelier. We didn't have the places to be. It was hard to be with other women as we had before. But women nonetheless remained lesbians. I mean, what happened, I think, for a lot of women is that they sort of withdrew into their neighborhoods because there wasn't anywhere outside there to gather together. But that's changing. A lot of those older lesbians, and I know them, are now getting re-involved in feminism and getting very excited by it all, which is a wonderful thing to see. But certainly they didn't go back to men, as some people might think. Maybe they did, because they were completely over men, completely.
And move on to our next question. Both in China and the West, many feminists claim that feminism has nothing to do with sexual orientation. They believe being sexually or romantically attracted to men should have no bearing on their feminist worth, and that political lesbianism is repressive in that it constrains women's genuine sexual desires. Why do you think becoming a lesbian is a political choice that liberates women?
Well, in my case, the reason I realized I had to become a lesbian was that other feminists said to me, you need to have a life in which your love, your sexuality, your partnerships, and your politics are one, so that you're not losing all of the energy, for instance. I mean, in heterosexual feminists, they may do a bit of activism in the day, but they go back to a man at night where they're servicing him, seeing him as the most important person in their world. Whereas we, who became lesbian feminists in the 70s and 80s, for us, women were the most important people in our world. Our lives were dedicated to the progress of women and to women's rights. And indeed, most of those that we were helping were heterosexual women, because, we were in the rape crisis movement, the anti-domestic violence movement, but we chose to put all of our energies into women and make a sort of closed circuit, if you like. Our energy goes into women and it comes out in the revolutionary struggle. And the idea that we'd have to go home and cook some man's dinner and be in his bed when we had actually nothing in common with him and were just servicing, I think that's a crazy idea, really. So obviously, we considered that the political lesbianism was fundamental to the movement. It's the powerhouse. It was the powerhouse. It is the powerhouse. We put our love into women, our force and our energy into women. And out of that comes the revolution. Of course, there are feminists who are heterosexual. Of course they are. But their feminism is different. It's a very different, and I would say much more limited kind of feminism, because their greatest loves are men. And for them, that obviously you can't be heterosexual with a man if you don't put that man first. That wouldn't make a lot of sense.
And you always underline, when discussing the social construction of sexuality, that whatever is socially constructed can be changed, allowing for revolution. You mentioned that back in the early 80s, you and other lesbian feminists ran workshops at conferences on how to change sexual fantasies. You believe that sexual fantasies may be altered or abandoned completely. For many women, though, that's easier said than done, especially when it comes to excluding men from their sexual fantasies. This helps explain why straight women try to downplay their sexuality, and lesbians distrust their heterosexual sisters. Would you mind elaborating on how those workshops help women overcome their undermining sexual fantasies? And what if such tactics may assist a straight woman in abandoning her heterosexuality and embarking on a lesbian journey?
Well, we are in very different times. At the times that we met together and talked about changing sexual fantasies, for instance, I think we were probably already all lesbians who did that. So it wasn't a group in which we were talking to heterosexual men about getting men out of their heads. That wasn't what was going on. but also we were part of a movement and a community in which we had similar understandings and experiences. I think the real problem now, particularly in China, of course, women are not able to get together. There are not consciousness-raising groups of women all over the country where they're talking about how they can change and so on. I presume that's not happening. So women obviously online cannot do these things. You can't talk about changing sexual fantasies online. That's something that has to be done in an atmosphere of trust and sisterhood and love between women often who know each other. It's something impossible to imagine. You can't have feminism online, not a movement. You can have some poor plant, some weak plant, but it's not a movement. So all of these changes are almost impossibly hard to make outside of a movement. And of course, another change that's happened since those times is the development of pornography. Back in the 1970s, I was involved in setting up the very first anti-pornography group in Britain in 1977. There was no online pornography. There was no online. There weren't even videos, really. It was just magazines in the corner shop. Whereas now, the pornography is used even by women and young women. It has a huge effect on constructing the fantasies, the sexual furniture of their minds. I can't imagine what that is like, because I think that the sexual fantasies we had in the 70s and 80s, we had to make up ourselves. You know, we'd have to, I don't know where we got them from, but now there's all this very, very terrible woman-hating pornography out there inside women's heads. So there certainly needs to be a way in which women can talk about the effect upon them of pornography and start to dismantle the effects of pornography upon them. That's a huge difference between my time and the time that you are in now. So there are major difficulties. I mean, back in the 1980s, we would sit around in a room and women would say, because we'd want to change the furniture of our heads, because, you know, if you have sexual fantasies and you have sexual response to something which is about your own degradation, for instance, that makes you feel very bad. It's undermining, it undermines your politics, makes you feel bad the next day and so on. So we talked about how to get rid of some of that sexual furniture. And we all roared with laughter because the fantasies were all absurd. I mean, they were just absurd. So a woman would say, I sometimes think about X, and we'd go, oh, that's ridiculous. And we'd all fall about laughing. And laughter cleanses the mind. You can't have your serious, nasty fantasies if everybody's laughing. I mean, it's simply impossible to do that. But that was something that we could do in the early 1980s. You have different problems now and on a very serious scale. So I don't want to pretend to know how you can approach all of that, but I am sure you will.
Yeah, I do feel like it's very difficult to conduct discussions online. And I think, yeah, doing discussions online creates distrust and suspicions, especially for women. So
That's
I do
right.
agree.
And especially if it's printed, somebody can then download it and send it to somebody else. She said this. It's not like a discussion in a room. So it's a very, very, very different situation.
Yes, we do need a trusting environment, and supportive environment.
Absolutely.
And in your book, Anti-Climax, you define heterosexual desire as the eroticized inequality of power, and homosexual desire as eroticized sameness of power, whether expressed within lesbian, gay, or heterosexual relationships. You articulate that heterosexual desire can exist also in same-sex relationships, because women and men do not escape the heterosexual construction of their desire simply by loving their own sex. You note in your later book, Lesbian Heresy, that some lesbians eschew sexual practice entirely because dominance and submission are too ingrained in our attitudes towards sex to be changed. As an alternative to deconstructive lesbianism, you propose a deliberate construction of homosexual desire, i.e., being as lesbians but without sex. These debates fascinate us since many Chinese heterosexual women argue that power and subordination exist in lesbian relationships as well, while dismissing political lesbianism. How would you respond to their critiques if you were us? And how would you reconcile your convictions that all feminists should become lesbians with the fact that lesbian couples can experience heterosexual desire?
Well, there's a lot of questions in there. I don't think we ever thought that lesbians wouldn't have sex, or that lesbians not having sex was the answer. The lesbians I knew were having sex all the time and with huge enthusiasm. So I don't think we ever very seriously thought about that as a solution. There was a group, though, in the mid-1980s in America called Women Against Sex, which apparently followed some of the ideas of Andrea Dworkin, and the women in that group, both heterosexual and lesbian, decided they weren't going to do sex anymore. But I don't know if that ever happening in Britain, and that was a tiny group. So I don't think that's what we were really doing. We were talking really about changing sexuality, because of course, as I explained earlier, in the 1980s, sadomasochism, a sadomasochist movement intruded into the feminist movement, mainly coming from gay men, who the vast majority of gay men were into sadomasochism at that time. And I needed to explain it and explain what was happening. And I used the concept of heterosexual desire and homosexual desire. I wanted to change those terms around because of the way they were used and the baggage that was attached to them. So I wanted homosexual to be the good bit and heterosexual to be the problem. And of course, heterosexual desire, I defined as eroticizing a power difference. And of course, the very basis of the relations between men and women is an eroticized power difference in the way women dress and the men dress and the way they behave. The sexual desire of heterosexuality is overwhelmingly about the eroticizing of power difference. Whether they choose to do sadomasochism or not, that is the basis of the desire. It's constructed out of the power relations of male dominance and women's subordination. And homosexual desire, I defined as the eroticizing equality of power. And it's something that I said we had to create, because you cannot have a successful women's liberation movement, you cannot have successful feminism unless you eroticize equality, because otherwise this constant sexuality of subordinate power and subordination is controlling women's lives and controlling the spaces in which women may move, constructing sadomasochism, sexual harassment, sex murder, abusive everyday sex, and so on. It's not possible to have freedom for women unless sexuality is transformed. So I said, yes, we needed to move towards homosexual desire, eroticizing equality. But I did recognize that heterosexual desire, eroticizing power difference, which comes from male domination, also intruded sometimes into the relationships of lesbians and very definitely gay men. I mean, there are particular problems with gay men, which is that for gay men, they see themselves and have always seen themselves as not quite the right thing. They're not heterosexual, they're not proper masculine men, which has caused for many gay men for there to be a default position of femininity and subordination through their entertainment of drag, for instance, and in sadomasochism. So it's a bit different from the situation that was happening between women. But I understand that what you're saying is that in China, or amongst Chinese feminists, there are accusations hurled at lesbians that actually they're just as violent as men. There's just as much nasty sexual violence going on. How can you say that lesbians are different? Well, I think there are several answers to this question. I mean, we do know that lesbians are different. Apart from anything else, no woman needs to walk down the street at night thinking that she's going to be killed for sexual fun by a woman. Now, we know that's never going to happen. So the way women are constructed and the way women's sexuality are constructed is very, very different from the way that men are constructed in the power relations of male domination. That is not to say that there is not sometimes violence between women in lesbian relationships. There is, but there is no evidence that it takes the forms or is as vicious as between men and women. I don't think that lesbians need to worry that a woman is going to try and strangle them, but strangulation is now an ordinary practice, unfortunately, amongst many young heterosexuals. And the idea of inflicting pain and sticking something anally into a woman to cause her pain, which is anal sex, is now normal amongst young heterosexuals. That's not going to happen between lesbians. So lesbians, I mean, apart from anything else, between lesbians, one partner cannot do something to the other which is just for their pleasure, whilst the other is trying to survive and think about the next day, like happens in sexual intercourse, penis in vagina sexual intercourse, simply doesn't actually exist. So you can't actually do that in lesbian relationships. So I think if people are saying lesbians are just as violent to each other and so on, they are fundamentally being hostile to lesbians and not understanding the whole way that men and women and sexuality are constructed in the power relationships of male domination. Because it's simply not possible for women to exhibit the behaviors that men exhibit. They are not on the street trying to harass and sexually attack, and I mean, that's not happening.
That's a very great answer and very great response to their criticisms. And going on to our next question, Chinese radical feminists are practicing separatism, which includes no marriage, dating, child rearing, or sex with men. We think that by doing so, we will be able to protect ourselves from male violence. What are your hopes for the future of the feminist movement?
Well, I am enormously impressed at what's happening in China and also Korea, where there are movements of young women who are saying they're simply not going to put up with it anymore, who are not putting up with beauty practices, they're cutting their hair, they're giving up makeup, giving up cosmetic surgery, which of course is huge in Asia, as you know. So women are giving up all of that and giving up relationships with men. I mean, it's a marvelous, marvelous thing. I think but what's interesting to me is it's not happening here, where once upon a time there was a huge separatist movement, and I am, of course, still a separatist, a huge separatist movement in the West. That's not true now. And very few women would be prepared to say that they're separatists today. I say it in the sense that, you know, I don't have emotional connections with men in my life, and I don't have them in my house, and so on and so on and so on. A simple thing to say. And actually, I don't read books by men, not for fun. And you know, so I am a separatist. So I'm very impressed that this is happening in places where it's very, very, very difficult to do. But it may be because life is so difficult for women in China and in Korea in terms of beauty practices and being forced into heterosexuality, that's why this political explosion is happening there. It could be because of the very extreme situation. And of course, I am trying to rebuild this movement here. I'm trying to make, I'm saying it everywhere I go. I say, look what's happening in China. Look what's happening in Korea. You know? And when I went to Korea a couple of years ago on a tour for Gender Hurts, and all these wonderful young women were coming to hear me, and I would look out over an audience where every woman had short hair. I mean, extraordinary. Whereas in this country right now, the newscasters who are women, the actresses, the politicians, they have horrendous hair coming right down to their waist in sort of ringlets like this. Really extraordinary fetish hair, fetishizing themselves for men's excitement and for men's hair fetishism. And of course, they've got tremendous high-heeled shoes on, which is for men's foot fetishism. So they're becoming these objects carrying fetishes in a terrifying way, much more than ever happened before. I mean, in the 1970s and 80s, there was something that was called a sort of unisex movement. It was very common for women to have short hair. It was very common for women to have flat shoes and so on. People forget that now, do not understand that that ever took place, but it did take place. So in the West, we've got an extreme exaggeration of the terrible fetishes that create women into objects for men. And we have in Asia a movement against this, which I do think is pretty darn impressive.
Yeah, I do think the extreme situations of women in Korea and China helps with their resistance. And I think because like the equality situation women in the West is much better than in Korea or China. And that partly contributes to women's inaction in terms of separatism.
I think that is possible. That is possible. I'm sure that has something to do with it. What's not happening in the West right now, and it clearly is in China and in Korea, is that the personal being political is not being recognized, that actually the revolution is about what you put on your body, what you put on your face, how you carry your body, as well as how you think, how you exist in the world. All of those things come together to create the future. In the West at the moment, feminism is very activism-based, which is great. It's achieving considerable successes, particularly in this country, the UK, against the men's cross-dressing movement. But it's very much about, we'll get out there with our placards and demonstrate, rather than working out how to change how you are thinking, how you are dressing, how you are being in the world. Whereas that is happening where you are for some women.
So finally, is there anything you'd like to say to Chinese feminists in terms of advice or messages?
And that is very difficult to do because, of course, it's a very, very, very different context. It's hard for me to imagine how you're managing to operate in the situation that you are. I don't know whether you're in China, Alice. It's very possible that you are not. But how to deal with creating a feminist movement in such a different context, I think, is not something I can offer advice on. As I say, I'm impressed by the way women are being able to create feminism there. And I'm working hard to try and make something quite as revolutionary in some ways here. So I don't know that my advice is going to be terribly useful to you. You're creating something different, which is going to relate to that different context. I mean, the mere fact that in Korea, for instance, and I think it's happening in China too, women are managing to create huge web platforms, social media platforms, which may start off being something like women supposedly discussing lipstick, and then are exploding into extraordinary feminist movements. That certainly happened in Korea. I don't know if that's what's happening in China. This is a very, very, very different context from anything. Well, I mean, it's beginning to happen here. There's something called Mumsnet.
Oh, yes.
Where there are feminists within that who are able to talk to each other, even though it was founded for mums to know where to buy the best nappies. But as I say, I don't think that I'm in the best position to give you advice, unfortunately. I just want to continue being astonished and thrilled.
Those are all the questions I have for us today. Thank you, Sheila, for your time.
Thank you, Alice. It's been very nice to talk to you.
Nice to talk to you, Sheila.